Since I've encountered the minor setback of a hard drive failure, I thought I'd do a video that doesn't involve that hard drive until it can be repaired. As everyone knows by now, Doom the Dark Ages took a number of different creative liberties with its gameplay in lieu of including a multiplayer option. This included a giant mech fighting sections and dragon levels. These levels were pretty polarizing among Doom fans, with most major YouTube critics typically erring on the side of distaste for the gameplay styles. I've seen some comments making passing allusions to the dragon levels in particular being something akin to Panzer Dragoon, both in a joking and somewhat serious way. So, me being very curious about games and looking at their similarities and differences, I thought it would be kind of neat, albeit unnecessary, to take a closer look into that comparison. How does Doom the Dark Ages dragon gameplay compare to Panzer Dragoon? Before diving into this, I should point out that I will be playing through and recording Doom the Dark Ages from the PS5 and Panzer Dragoon from native Sega Saturn hardware using the original Japanese disc. Not that the Japanese part means anything, I guess, since the game doesn't really require much written language anyway, but that's beside the point. I played both games to completion without any tricks, cheats, or whatever might exist out there, if that detail really matters. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about Panzer Dragoon. Panzer Dragoon is one of those must-have games for any Sega Saturn owner. It was arguably the first real killer app for the console despite its delays, since it is an early example of what was graphically possible for the Saturn during a time when Sony really aggressively pushed developers to utilize the PlayStation's own 3D capabilities in the early years. Panzer Dragoon, however, is far from a simple tech demo for the Saturn. It aspires to tell a story and takes the player on an epic, albeit short, adventure. Your character, Kale, I think that's how you pronounce it, is chosen by the mortally wounded rider of a blue dragon to stop the rider of the black dragon from touching a black tower. This black tower is a mysterious remnant of an ancient civilization destroyed in a great war which brought about ruin to most human civilization in the world. The Empire, one of the burgeoning civilizations emerging in the world, finds this spire and initially uses its weapons technology to make the world a safer place by fighting off the ever-present threat of dangerous monsters that harm humans. That power has since corrupted the Empire, and now they seek to conquer all with this technology. The power of this spire is something that the rider and the black dragon want for themselves. It's up to Kale to reach this spire and defeat the black dragon before they have the chance to reach it. During this adventure, Kale travels through sunken ruins, a massive desert, an ancient ruins site heavily occupied by the Empire, an abandoned section of those ruins still under the protection of the Sentinels created by the ancient civilization, to a forested area, and a final showdown with the Imperial fleet's strongest ships, to the ruined Imperial capital, and finally a showdown with the Black Dragon. Panzer Dragoon is a 3D shoot-'em-up game. The game is on rails, so you control the dragon and its rider as you fly through scripted parts of levels shooting down various enemies. The gameplay is quite simple, and while for some it might not seem quite engaging enough, especially for a modern audience now more accustomed to more complex gameplay styles, there is a great feeling that comes from the possibility of mastering Panzer Dragoon. The Dragon is controlled with the D-pad. The A, B, and C buttons all fire the rider's weapon, which is a single shot that looks kind of like a laser blast, for lack of a better term. Despite them all being different buttons, the projectiles are all the same. The X, Y, and Z buttons are used to adjust camera angles, specifically adjusting the field of view to fixed positions behind the Dragon. I typically never mess around with these settings since the default FOV works fine for me, but given how so many modern games have much more granular FOV settings options, this might seem a bit primitive nowadays. Holding down the A, B, or C buttons causes the targeting reticle to rotate rapidly. This indicates an ability for the Dragon to lock onto a certain number of enemies and fire guided missiles at them. This can also work with most bosses as well. I should note that at least without a turbo controller, the rider's shooting speed is only as fast as the player's speed at pressing the fire button. There is no rapid fire option, none that I could find anyway. The L and R bumpers can be used to rotate the camera to the left or right view of the Dragon respectively. It changes to something approximating a first-person view and allows you to point the target reticle at enemies or incoming projectiles to shoot them. This option gives you a 360-degree view of your surroundings and is necessary to interact with in later levels. Now, if there is one complaint I have about the controls, it really isn't the controls themselves, but the controller design. The placement of the L and R bumpers led me to accidentally pressing them multiple times in many cases, which led to a number of avoidable deaths, especially during the final two bosses. I feel like if the controller was designed to have the bumpers oriented more to the rear of the controller rather than the front, a lot of these mistakes could have been avoided. But maybe that's just me. I typically rest my index fingers on top of whatever controller I'm playing, and since those bumpers on the Saturn controller are already very sensitive and have very little throw or tactile feedback when pressed, sometimes it can be really difficult to realize that the reason the camera is rotating 180 degrees in the opposite direction of the boss you're fighting is because you had apparently hit the bumper twice without even knowing it. Is that just me? What I can say, however, is that isn't the fault of the game itself. The game controls and functions exactly the way you'd expect it to, and while the vertical movement features inverted controls by default, it is easily changed in the options menu at the game's boot screen. Although it's simple, Panzer Dragoon is a tight controlling game and is extremely responsive, and is a fantastic early example of what the Saturn is capable of. Since the game features a boss fight at the end of nearly every level, I thought I'd give my thoughts on how the levels and bosses play. The levels as a whole are structured very much like a shmup, where levels and enemy behaviors play out the exact same way every time. This means it's up to the player to memorize enemy attack patterns and spawn points and timing. They never change their behavior, so mastery of the game really comes down to developing an intimate knowledge of the levels, their layouts, and timing. Upon completion of every level, the game will rank your performance based on the percentage of enemies shot down in the stage. This grants you additional continues once your shot down percentage passes a certain threshold. There are no saves in Panzer Dragoon. Since there are only 6 levels plus a final boss, saves really aren't necessary. Once you lose a life, you must use a continue if you want another chance. Once you use one, you start again from the beginning of the level. There are no mid-level checkpoints. Once you use all your continues, you are sent back to the beginning of the game and must start over again. Panzer Dragoon, then, is structured much like an arcade game, where it forces you to learn and practice levels upon failure over and over again until you can, at some point, earn some level of mastery. At the end of the game, you are ranked one final time based on the average percentage of enemies shot down in every level, and you are given a title that reflects that. You can then restart from the beginning and to go for a higher percentages per stage to increase your average percent to get a new title. This game really banks on its potential replay value for those who are into really mastering games and earning 100% completion. The bosses are probably one of the biggest highlights of Panzer Dragoon for me. I don't want to say that I see the levels as a means to getting to the stage's end boss, since I really do enjoy the levels, especially levels 4 and 5. But the bosses are great in how they ramp up in difficulty as you progress through the story, and each require different strategies. The first boss is a small Imperial ship. This is actually where the game teaches you that there are some projectiles fired at you that you can shoot and destroy yourself before it has the chance to hit you. The boss fight also teaches you that you can lock onto multiple hard points on the ship to do damage with homing missiles from your dragon, so that you don't have to button mash your way through the boss if you don't want to. One of the cool things about this boss is that there are individual parts of the ship that can be destroyed to disable its ability to use certain weapons against you and to do additional damage to it. The second boss is the Black Dragon you met at the game's opening video. This boss is incredibly easy. You chase the dragon through the vast dune-inspired deserts while avoiding his attacks, which follow a very simple and predictable pattern. You can take this boss down very quickly by locking onto him multiple times at once and letting him have it with your dragon's homing missiles. This boss only foreshadows what you're to face in the future, however, and the dialogue-free scene that plays upon his defeat suggests as such. The third boss you encounter when you finish running through the Empire's highly militarized base in the mountain. This is the first boss that features 2 phases. This boss takes a bit of time to get itself assembled, as its bottom half pulls in from behind you at first and its top half a little later. After combining, it begins attacking you in earnest. Dealing tons of damage to this boss is, again, as easy as simply locking onto it several times at once and giving it salvo after salvo of homing shots from your dragon. The tricky part comes from dodging its attacks. First, you have to move between the blades of its rotors, which kind of look like a skirt. After dealing enough damage to the boss in this form, it will change its attack pattern by firing a combination of regular projectiles and homing projectiles that you are best advised to destroy. This particular section also requires that you change the direction you're facing so that you can both defend yourself and continue to do damage to the boss. Once the boss's HP meter gets low enough, it will do one final desperate attack on you. This is easy to stop by simply blasting at it the way you have been up to this point. Since it's very fragile, at this point it goes down very easily. Imperial forces will eventually chase you into a cave carved into the side of one of the mountains, just outside the Imperial facility. There, you will eventually run into my favorite boss of this game, the Ancient Sentinel. This boss is unique because it is the only boss, at least I'm pretty sure it's the only boss, that is entirely immune to your dragon's lock-on attack, meaning you are best advised to blast it with your regular weapon. You can't just blast it, however, you have to blast its weak points, of which it has 3. 2 from the beginning, which then reveal the one at the end. The two initial weak points are the wings, which the Sentinel will periodically shoot at you, which also have a boomerang effect. And it will also use them to fire a homing projectile attack at you as well. It also has a deadly laser attack that it will use increasingly as you continue to do considerable damage to it. Once the wings are destroyed, you are required to shoot its head. This is when the only attack it has left is the green laser. This attack can deal devastating amounts of damage very quickly, but its pattern is easy enough to recognize that it is pretty easy to avoid once you know what you're doing. This area eventually leads to the next stage. It's probably the one in contention for my favorite stage. In this stage, you face off against the Empire's fleet. The boss at the end of this stage, I presume, is the Empire's greatest weapon. I don't know how to describe what exactly it is, but it makes a scary sound and is armed to the teeth with tons of weapons relative to anything else you've faced up to this point. This boss features two stages as well. In the first stage, you must take out the 3 rotating discs, which house weapons that can fire a devastating barrage of projectiles at you for massive damage. They all vary in size, and I typically opt to destroy either the large or medium-sized ones first, since the small one, while harder to hit, is also easier to defend yourself from by itself. After taking them out, the boss will throw the discs off and show its dorsal side, which houses 3 more weak points, as well as a rotating cylinder much like a revolver that fires 2 different kinds of large, homing projectiles at you, which you must destroy. Once you take out these 3 weak points, the boss will begin to explode and fall apart. This is the coolest destruction scene in this game. I should also note that in my experience with this boss, I never felt that locking on with the homing missiles ever accomplished what the default weapon couldn't faster. I don't know if my button mashing skills are necessarily the greatest, but my technique makes it a lot easier to just button mash the boss out of existence rather than playing around with the lock on all the while the boss is giving you simultaneous triple layered broadsides like those from a ship of the line or something. Then we reach the final boss, and man, is this boss intense. Actually, despite its attack pattern being quite long for this game's standards, it's actually pretty easy to memorize. This is the Black Dragon from the beginning of the game, this time powered up. He has a number of attacks, and this time summons a team of drones which will collectively fire 2 different types of homing shots at you. Some you can destroy, and some that can only be dodged. He will also use the same wave attack that he used against you in the first encounter, only this time it takes up much more screen space, and the attacks are much faster and don't give you much time to dodge them unless you preempt them. He will also try to snipe you from behind you with his drones using homing missiles, and will also use them to fire a super laser attack, which I swear amounts to a screen nuke, since I really don't know if it's possible to avoid taking damage from this, at least a little bit. All that being said, avoiding these attacks can be pretty simple once you know what you're doing. Following behind him in the beginning will almost guarantee that you won't be hit by his drones. Indestructible laser blasts, shooting down the missiles when he tries to snipe you from behind is pretty simple to do. Remembering the pattern when he does the wing attack so that you can be in a safe position well before he attacks is easy to do, and avoiding the tail whip is actually not so bad. I don't know why I always got hit by it, but it's actually pretty easy to avoid despite my performance suggesting otherwise. The Super Laser Blast is really tough to avoid taking damage from entirely, but you can greatly mitigate its potential damage by continually moving about the screen in a square pattern, kind of similar to the Ancient Sentinel boss. Because this boss requires so much movement and avoidance of damage on your part, this also means dealing damage to him is actually the easy part. No kidding, I almost beat this boss on my first attempt, not because I was really good at avoiding his various attacks, but because I just kept feeding him salvo after salvo of missile attacks. Moving around in Panzer Dragoon while having your lock-on activated makes it a lot simpler to lock on to multiple targets at once, especially on bosses. So naturally, thanks to both your and his movement about the screen constantly, you can deplete the health of this boss very quickly, which would probably explain why his health bar is also the biggest of all the bosses in the game. So how about the dragon stages in Doom: The Dark Ages? These stages have the Doom Slayer piloting a dragon through parts of stages, and the dragon's general role is to facilitate the destruction of key target sites, which would be difficult to reach on foot. That meaning that, in general, there aren't any stages I would personally consider exclusively dragon stages, since you are typically switching from dragon to boots on the ground whenever the dragon is present. The controls are pretty simple. You use the left analog stick to move the dragon forward, backward, left, and right, and the right analog stick is used for camera control. R1 and L1 are to move up and down respectively, though I rarely ever used this, and I reckon most never did. You use the R2 trigger to fire your weapon, which are twin 3-barreled rotating Vulcan cannons. They are fully automatic, so you can hold them down for continuous fire. If you click the left analog stick down, you can get your dragon to activate its jet thrusters, which makes him travel quickly forward and considerably speeds up your rate of fire. There is also a targeting system, which is important for taking down certain targets of interest, like titans and stationary turrets. These stationary, ground-based enemies are the only real threat to the Doomslayer and his dragon while in the air, and can be taken down by activating a powered-up version of the dragon's cannon fire. This is accomplished by locking onto the enemy and waiting for it to fire a projectile which you can perfect dodge. A perfect dodge can be accomplished by holding the circle button and pressing any direction on the left analog stick. The shots fired at you typically require you to dodge in one of the 4 cardinal directions, but for some enemies you can dodge in any direction. A perfect dodge makes the dragon's cannon fire a more powerful shot, which can be used to break that enemy's shield and destroy them. This can be chained from one enemy to the next without performing additional perfect dodges if you are quick enough to lock onto and move to the next enemy before the powered-up cannon wears off. Additionally, you will occasionally encounter other flying enemies. These enemies never fight back, but can only be chased while the dragon is boosting. This is for a couple of reasons: to keep up with the pace of the enemy craft, and to increase the rate of fire for the dragon so that you can take down the enemy craft faster. These enemies can drop useful pickups when destroyed, but it should be noted that some of these enemies are on a timer and will teleport away after a certain amount of time being chased if you don't destroy it fast enough. Overall, the dragon sections of Doom: The Dark Ages aren't full gameplay modes in themselves. Since the game is a first-person shooter first and foremost, The additional gameplay modes act more as something akin to a palate cleanser, as a way to break up the gameplay from the campaign to add some variety to it. Because of this, I do feel that the criticism towards the Dragon and Atlan sections of this game are a bit overblown. These are clearly supplemental gameplay sections, meant to be more like a gameplay garnish to the FPS main course, so to expect these sections to have greater depth when that really is seldom the purpose of alternative gameplay styles in the first place just seems misplaced at best and disingenuous at worst. So all that being said, how similar or different are these two from each other? Is Doom the Dark Ages channeling its inner Panzer Dragoon, or are they on their own separate wavelengths? On a conceptual level, I do believe it almost does beg at least a passing comparison. Both games feature mostly on-rails, shoot-'em-up style gameplay, where your character rides on the shoulders of a dragon. Doom the Dark Ages isn't entirely on rails, however, since stages can and do open up into larger non-linear areas that, while ultimately serving as funnels to a singular objective, stray pretty extremely from the entirely scripted and carefully timed on-rails sections of Panzer Dragoon. While it may not appear as such just from seeing the gameplay, I can say with utmost confidence that from a tactile experience, Panzer Dragoon is a much more mechanically involved gameplay experience, whereas Doom the Dark Ages relies heavily on single button actions that lead to scripted visual sequences, which suggest higher levels of player input than what's actually happening. The more analog experience of Panzer Dragoon makes a lot more sense for a game of its kind rather than for Doom the Dark Ages, however. Panzer Dragoon came out in 1995 for the Sega Saturn. This was during a time when games released in certain genres were essentially locked to that gameplay style, thanks mostly to technical limitations of the time. While I'm sure there are some exceptions from the time, I think that falls outside the norms from then. Panzer Dragoon, being a 3D rail shooter, meant it had to get as much out of that gameplay style as possible. While some might argue that the game is still a bit short even for its time, something that was remedied in its sequel, what gave Panzer Dragoon its reputation for excellence as a game from its era was the fact that the gameplay was as well designed and as tightly locked down as it was, despite being rushed to meet the release window for the Sega Saturn. The only aspect of the game that is automated is the forward movement and the timed enemy appearances. Doom the Dark Ages dragon sections are a bit different. The dragon sections in Doom the Dark Ages are pretty easy, very easy when compared to Panzer Dragoon, which itself is already considered a bit too easy by some. Through the dragon sections of Doom the Dark Ages, you go through them specifically on the dragon pretty much uncontested. Nothing substantial really stands in your way, and it's pretty easy to make total mincemeat of the few stationary enemies that obstruct your progression. The other flying enemies are seemingly incapable of fighting back and only run from you. The Doomslayer then establishes air supremacy just by existing in the airspace, which, to be honest, kind of tracks with the nature of his character and the story of the game in general. I know most people opt to skip the story, but then they lose the potential context as to why things might be the way they are. Yes, these sections are easy compared to Doom the Dark Ages' own core gameplay loop, but as mentioned before, these dragon sections really only function as an intermediary period to add some variety to the game. The amount of additional development time required to flesh out these dragon sections to make them match the depth of the core gameplay would have been immense and unrealistically so for something just meant to supplement the main gameplay focus. With that said, yes, these sections aren't very involved gameplay experiences and rely mostly on visual spectacle to give the player and viewers the illusion that the game is requiring more player interaction than what is actually happening. Playing the game in isolation, you don't really notice it, and because of that, I think the game is pretty effective at selling this spectacle. It doesn't really become more apparent that it isn't so demanding until after playing something of similar ilk, like Panzer Dragoon, which is a much more analog gameplay experience in terms of what it demands from the player. Yes, you can lock onto almost any enemy in the game and blast them, but not every enemy can be destroyed in such a manner, and it still requires a degree of repetition and memorization from the player in order to make the smartest and most effective movements on the screen in order to limit the amount of damage taken, especially in the later levels. Since you go completely uncontested in Doom the Dark Ages, and you have a perfect dodge that simplifies dodging projectiles that are already highly choreographed, the challenge doesn't really exist on a mechanical level, at least not nearly to the same extent as Panzer Dragoon. Most importantly of all, however, is that it is clear that these gameplay styles, while they might look similar, are nowhere close to similar to each other in practice. At least, I couldn't say that there is anything bringing Doom the Dark Ages dragon sections close to Panzer Dragoon at all, outside of sharing a similar concept and visual aesthetic. As a gameplay experience, they do not translate into each other at all. If you're a pro at either and try to use that skill to the other, you will find yourself hit with a learning curve that renders the latter completely foreign to the former. This comparison really only further serves to illustrate that similar gameplay styles at the surface level and similar aesthetics do not necessarily make the games any more comparable. Much like what I pointed out in my Shenmue vs. Yakuza video, except here is probably an even more striking difference despite visual similarities than what exists between Sega's two most famous action-adventure games. If this comparison taught me anything, it was a greater appreciation for games and the way they are designed. All too often, people will take too much of a reductive conclusion about games simply because they might look the same or share the same genre. You just do this and this and this the whole time. Art in general suffers from this kind of pseudo-intellectual analysis masquerading as profound thought, when in actuality it's just another example of anti-intellectual, uncritical, and typically bad faith analysis. Doom the Dark Ages seems to have suffered this quite a bit in the days before and after it was released, with many prominent voices claiming that the game is just some combination of shoot, parry, melee. Instead of getting down to what the real issue they might be having is, they just make it out to be the fault of the game and its designers not taking any time to reflect on themselves and how their own pre-existing opinions and feelings about certain styles of gameplay might be coloring their opinions of that game. Instead, they take the reductionist approach to the games they don't like and cite that reductionist conclusion as representative of the entire gameplay experience and make it out to be the reason it's bad, all while being seemingly unaware that these types of criticisms are so universal it can be applied to every game, especially the ones that they have historically liked. Since reductionist arguments are typically made in bad faith, it makes it even easier to pin against other games, which only highlights the uncritical nature of this form of criticism. Doom the Dark Ages dragon sections aren't just modern Panzer Dragoon because it's a dragon that is sometimes on rails that flies and shoots enemies, because the way you are meant to accomplish that goal asks for a skill set that is totally different from Panzer Dragoon. They are different styles of gameplay. That's part of the reason why I like doing these kinds of comparisons, because for me, it's fun to highlight the differences between games that most people assume to be similar just on the basis of visual or conceptual similarity. I hope that with this brand of video I can continue to dispel, at least to some degree, even if it's just by 1%, that there is more to the experience of games than just the words used to summarize their concept and their art direction.